Midsummer Murders, a British TV show set in a fictional English county. Given the high murder rates in the county, Midsummer's entire population should by now be dead. At a 2012 murder trial, the defendant likened the accusations against him to a plot straight out of Midsummer Murders. Our moment in crime is the murder of Lieutenant Colonel Robert Workman. 30th of November 2004. Fred Moss, a 21-year-old traveller, left the home he shared with his parents for the final time. He took his lurcher, Nellie, with him and drove off in his bright yellow Astra van. Fred knew his killer. Christopher Nudds, 24, had arranged to meet with Fred that November day. CCTV footage and mobile phone data would place Fred and Christopher in various locations in the English county of Hertfordshire. By the middle of the afternoon that day, Christopher had lured Fred to a rural area. By 4 p.m, Fred had been killed. Christopher shot Fred execution style in the head before dismembering him. Fred's remains were then placed in Hessian sacks and bin bags before being placed on wooden pallets and set on fire. Christopher then took Nellie to a location 9 miles away and let the dog loose in order to draw attention away from the crime scene. But justice would soon catch up with Fred's killer, even though nothing was left of his body. Christopher was arrested 6 days after finding Fred's abandoned van. Although it took some time, a weapon that had Fred's DNA on it was found. Christopher was found guilty of Fred's murder in 2006. But it was while Christopher was being held in custody at Bedford Prison for his friend's murder that something significant happened. While watching a news report about Fred's murder, Christopher turned to his cellmate and said he'd done Fred's family a favour, adding, "At least they won't have to buy him a coffin." But Christopher had a secret, one that he couldn't keep to himself any longer. Once again he turned to his cellmate. Christopher had another confession to make. In January 2004, Christopher was living with his parents in the Hertfordshire village of Pelham. Not much is known about him, other than the fact that he was a pest controller by trade, a job he'd learned to do by following in his father's footsteps. He'd held a shotgun certificate since the age of 13, and became the owner of a full-length shotgun when he began work as a pest controller. But by the time 2004 rolled around, Christopher no longer had a shotgun license. He did, however, have a sawn-off shotgun that he kept stashed under the seat of his car. This shotgun would go on to play a role in a horrific murder. Ferneux Pelham is a village close to Pelham. On the morning of the 8th of January 2004, Ferneux Pelham resident Josette Swanson headed to the home of her neighbour, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Workman. The Colonel was known to everyone as Riley, and Josette was the elderly man's carer. Everything about the day appeared to be normal, until Josette approached Riley's home. The front door to his house was wide open, and a pair of feet stuck out over the threshold. Riley lay on his back in the entranceway of his home. Alarmed, Josette grabbed the rug that Riley lay on and dragged it further into the house. She called 999, thinking that her neighbour had suffered a heart attack. When the emergency services arrived at the scene, they agreed. Riley's death was a natural one. But when the undertakers attempted to move Riley's body, it became clear that his death was anything but natural. Riley had been shot. Riley was 83 at the time of his death. He was a veteran of the Second World War and received the Burma Star, a medal given to subjects of the British Commonwealth who served in the Burma campaign during World War II. His military career saw him stationed in Germany, Cyprus, Nigeria and Canada, as well as spending time in the USA. He served with the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry before retiring from the Royal Green Jackets in 1965. His army career had lasted 25 years, and now a career as an antiques dealer awaited. In 1968, he married Gladys Parker, and the couple set up home in Ferneux Pelham, in a cottage called Hollyhock House. Over time, the home's name changed to Cock House, or Cock House in the Causeway. Mrs. Workman, who went by the name Joanna, insisted that their home be listed in the phone book as Hollyhock House, as she loved the name. It was the cottage's original name that would come to the authorities' attention during the investigation into Riley's murder. On the evening of the 7th of January 2004, Josette said goodbye to Riley after fulfilling her care duties. She left him sitting in his living room drinking whiskey. As the front door closed, the house became silent. Riley was all alone. After battling illness for some time, Joanna had passed away in April of the previous year. Josette had been employed by Riley to help him care for Joanna. When she died, Riley continued to employ Josette as his carer. Riley lovingly referred to Josette as his semi-detached daughter. Once Joanna passed away, Josette was all that Riley had, as the rest of his family lived in Australia. Riley had altered his will to include Josette among the beneficiaries. Josette learned of this after Riley was killed. So when there was a knock on the door of his home at 8:15 p.m, it's possible that Riley expected Josette to be on the other side of the door. Riley used his walking stick to help him move into the hallway and open the front door. But the person on the other side of the door was not Josette. Instead, Riley was confronted by someone stood 11 to 13 feet away, holding a 12-bore sawn-off shotgun. As Riley began to look away, probably so he could call for help, he was shot point blank with buckshot, normally used for killing deer. At 5 a.m. the next morning, a 999 call was made from a phone box in the nearby village of Brohing. The caller asked for an ambulance to go to Hollyhock Cottage, the original name of Riley's home. When the caller was asked to spell out Ferneux Pelham, an old spelling was used. As the name Hollyhock Cottage had not been used in years, the ambulance crew could not locate the house, and it was decided that the call was a hoax. Detective Inspector Colin Sparrow investigated Riley's murder. Progress was slow. Nothing was missing from Riley's home, and there was no forensic evidence. 3,000 people were interviewed, and a £10,000 reward was offered. A tip from a prisoner at Parkhurst Prison on the Isle of Wight provided police with a lead. The prisoner told police that Riley was gay. This suggested that Riley had been murdered by a former lover or by someone who held a grudge about Riley's sexuality. Police were able to confirm that Riley visited gay clubs in London in the 1950s and 60s. Detective Sparrow said, "We have spent many hours researching Riley's life and have come to get a better understanding of an incredibly private man. We have established that there is every likelihood that Riley was gay. We look upon this information in the eyes of a time where homosexuality is an acceptable part of our society. However, it was a very different story when Riley was a young man. Not only was homosexuality outlawed, Riley would have certainly had to sacrifice his military career had the army found out." The police appealed to anyone who may have known about Riley's sexuality. Gay police officers were put on standby to field any calls. Inquiries took the police to Hertfordshire, Gloucestershire, Guernsey, Malta, Australia, and the US. But the killer turned out to be a man who was arrested soon after the murder and released without charge. That man was Christopher Nudds. It took another confession from Christopher to a different cellmate before police were able to review Riley's case. After listening to Christopher's confession, the second cellmate came forward with information about Riley's murder. Christopher told his cellmate information that only the killer would know. He revealed the location of the murder weapon and asked his cellmate to dispose of it if he was ever released. He mentioned that Riley was using a walking stick, and he spoke of how he waited until Riley began to turn away before shooting him, adding that he, quote, didn't like to shoot people while looking into their eyes, end quote. The police spent years reviewing the case. By now, Christopher was still serving time for Fred Moss's murder, and after entering a civil partnership, he changed his surname to Doherty Puncheon. He was finally charged with Riley's murder in July 2010. Initially, Christopher denied knowing Riley, before later saying he'd worked for him on 3 occasions. But Christopher's motive for the murder has never been fully established. Christopher said he killed Riley in relation to a matter that occurred 7 years prior to the murder. He also claimed to be a hitman who had once been hired to kill someone in Australia, and that he was paid £60,000 by people from London to kill Riley. It was also suggested that Christopher and Riley had once had an affair, with Christopher confirming the relationship and describing Riley as wealthy and generous. What is known is that Riley first met Christopher in 1998, when he hired Christopher to take care of a wasp's nest on his property. Riley would go on to use Christopher's pest control services again, but over time their relationship, whether professional or something more, turned sour. Josette Swanson would testify at trial, saying that Riley had become wary of Christopher, and when he began having trouble with rats in his home, not long before he was killed, Riley refused to use Christopher as a pest controller again. The prosecution put forward the following theory regarding Christopher's motive at his trial, which began in 2012 at St Albans Crown Court. Fred Moss was a drug user, and Riley found out about his addiction. Christopher knew that Riley was gay and suspected that he had, quote, tried it on, end quote, with Moss. Christopher confronted Riley about this, and when Riley threatened to go to the police about Moss's drug addiction, Christopher killed Riley. Moss was murdered when he discovered Christopher had killed Riley. At the trial, the defence argued that Josette Swanson could have been involved in the murder. They cited the fact that Riley had given her a mobile phone and money, as well as changing his will to include her. But Riley had kept a record of every financial transaction between himself and Josette, and, as previously mentioned, Josette had no idea she'd been included in Riley's will until police told her so after his murder. During the trial, Christopher told the court that on the day of the shooting, he had gone to Heathrow Airport to pick up a couple returning from their honeymoon in South Africa. He then drove the couple to Norfolk before driving home to Stocking, Pelham. After walking his dogs, he returned home at 6 p.m, where he remained until the next day. Although there was little forensic evidence, circumstantial evidence contradicted Christopher's alibi. Christopher's uncle had seen a sawn-off shotgun hidden in his nephew's vehicle. On the day of the murder, Christopher arranged for any calls to his landline to be diverted to his mobile phone's voicemails. 2 hours after the murder, Christopher used his mobile to call his answer phone and pick up messages, despite telling the police he was home at that time. His Range Rover with a personalised number plate that spelled out Soho was seen close to Riley's home the day of the murder, as well as during the hours Christopher told police he was at home. And when the 999 call was placed early the next morning, a lorry driver saw a four-wheel drive vehicle with its headlights on, parked near the phone box used to make the call. Christopher said he was innocent during the trial and said that both of his cellmates were lying about the confessions. When it came to deciding the verdict, the jury was told to treat confessions made in custody with, quote, considerable caution, end quote, and that prisoners could get reduced sentences or financial rewards for giving evidence to the police. But after 17 hours of deliberation, a majority verdict found Christopher guilty of the murder of Lieutenant Colonel Robert Workman. He was given a life sentence with a minimum of 32 years to be served. Christopher has continued to proclaim his innocence. A link to a statement from Christopher is available in the description box for those interested. But for Riley's family, they have to live with the fact that the life of the World War II veteran ended in such a brutal way. In a statement they said, "Riley was a loving and loyal man who was remembered fondly by all of his family and friends. Since his murder, we have struggled to come to terms with how someone could so brutally kill another human being, particularly a defenseless 83-year-old who was so frail and desolate at the loss of his beloved wife.